am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear from Mr. Brad Westwood, the Harold B. Lee Library's L. Tom Perry Special Collections Department Chair and curator of the exhibit entitled Designing BYU, Planning, Architecture, Landscape. Mr. Westwood's lecture is entitled 2D Dreams and 3D Realities, Campus Planning and Architecture at BYU, 1875 to 1975. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lecture Series and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's lecturer. Brad Westwood is one of us, having earned a bachelor's degree in American Studies at BYU in 1985. After graduation, he worked for the church as an assistant and then associate archivist in the church historical department, where he was the archivist for photographic materials and then archivist of the architecture collection. Following his years at the church historical department, he moved to Philadelphia and was a part-time archivist over the architecture archives in the Lewis I. Kahn Archive in the Graduate School of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania. He received an MS degree in historical preservation from Penn, his thesis being entitled The Early Career of Joseph Don Carlos Young, Utah's first institutionally trained architect. After a brief stint in private practice and consulting, Brad rejoined the church historical department as an archivist and preservation officer, and then joined BYU as archivist and manuscripts processor in late 1995. I have been told that no one knows more about church and BYU architecture than Brad. He has published essays and articles on Mormon architecture and taught classes at BYU on planning, architecture, and landscape design. Brad has also been the curator of a major exhibit in the Special Collections Library detailing the evolution and creation of BYU architecture, and was instrumental in reconstructing a scale model 3D map of the campus, which resides in the library auditorium just next door. It is a marvelous feat of architectural modeling, and I urge you all to spend some time viewing it and the accompanying diorama. It is with great pleasure that we welcome today our featured House of Learning lecture speaker, Mr. Brad Westwood.
Thank you, Brian. It's my pleasure to be with you today. Using a film and television cliche, there are 1,000 stories in the city, or should I say, on this campus. The exhibition that we are opening today tells only a minute fraction of the stories and significant facts related to a near 130-year enterprise we know as Brigham Young University. Over the next 7 months, various other events besides this one will take place, including various other installations such as additional 3D elements. We will also have a web presence, a lecture, and a number of other things related to this topic. And so we ask you all to return again to see this exhibit and all the other newer things that come about over the course of the next 7 months. I'd like to first acknowledge my curator, co-curator, Gordon Daines. If he's here, Gordon, if you will stand. Gordon and I have been working for 3 years on this exhibit, and we were fortunate enough to teach an honors course on the same title, Designing BYU, and we had some wonderful students that helped us with the research in this exhibit. I'd like to note underwriters, those who helped us financially to put this exhibit together. Robert and Lisa Wheatley, the family of Ben E. Lewis, and the library's Creative Work Committee. BYU's Public Affairs and Guest Relations, along with the BYU Planning Department and the Friends of the Harold B. Lee Library, generously paid for the restoration and the modernization of a 1/4 scale model of campus located on the first floor here in the Lee Library. I should add that that model was first built in the 1990s with the generous gift of Mr. Jack Wheatley. I also want to thank Scott Briggs, Director of BYU Physical Plant, who allowed us to use his sublime 2002 panoramic view of campus, which we've also used in the exhibit today. Besides Gordon Daines, who I just mentioned before, and thanking him for his wonderful partnership, I want to acknowledge the exhibit manager and designer, Sean McMurdy, who has worked tirelessly to put this exhibit together with his team, including Aaron Monson, Amanda Cockrell, Justin Groh, Annette Steele, and Amy Norlander. I also want to thank Mike Gee, the chair of the Lee Library Audio-Visual Unit, or head rather, and his students, Chris Garcia, Joe Wilson, Andy Lorimer, David O'Hire, Bo Hacking, and Ryan Farms. BYU Head of Planning, Warren Jones, who kept his door open for 2.5 years answering all of my distracting questions, I'd like to thank as well. He and his staff have been just wonderful in answering my questions. I also want to note Gary Hone, who is with us today, who is the keeper of the current and historical architectural records. He was very kind and patient as I looked through all these drawings working on this exhibit. I also want to acknowledge our collection manager, David Layton, our administrative assistant, Susan Corrigan, and her students, Rachel Carter, Melissa Mangeson, Nikki Farrell, and Brittany Johnson. Now that's a lot of names, but BYU cannot run without its students, and that is particularly true of special collections. And so I thank them all for their part. Winston Churchill said, and you've probably all heard this saying, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." BYU has shaped all of us. I will offer 7 stories in the next 40 minutes that speak of the built environment, all that shaped BYU. And they are as follows: the first tailor-made school, the Brigham Young Academy, the first building on Temple Hill and BYU's first campus plan in 1909, the landscape designs of LaValle Morris, BYU's first tailor-made dormitories by Joseph Smith and the surrounding Provo community, the second major campus plan after World War II by Fred Markham, and if we have time, we'll talk about Bertrand Harrison's Botanical Gardens and the mid-1950s and 1960 comprehensive plan of BYU, what I call the mid-20th century campus, most of which we encounter today is mostly started in that mid-century period. BYU's first tailor-made school was designed in 1884 and was completed later in 1892, largely as it was drawn in 2 dimension. Carl Mazur's ideal LDS community school is what we see before us in this picture. You have elementary, secondary, collegiate, and normal education, which is the teaching of teachers. This is the 1884 drawing of that building by Joseph Don Carlos Young. This became the Holy Grail, the architectural Holy Grail, for me as one interested in Mormon and BYU architecture. We found the drawings of the academy in an abandoned storage unit just prior to a number of book dealers ready to converge on it. And with the University of Utah, we were able, that is the LDS Church and the University of Utah in cooperation, to acquire all the drawings that were in this storage unit, and wadded up in gray paper and very brittle were the drawings of the Academy building. The design is based on Mazer's knowledge of German and Prussian schools, British and American school reform movement, and an appreciation for learning, which is part of the LDS doctrine. Here is a drawing of Room D, as you can see up above. Those of you who are familiar with this room, this is the great room where resuscitations occur at the end of the day. This is where assemblies begin in the morning, where all the student body gather. What I'd like to do now is show you a 3D animation of the Academy building. The building, designed by Joseph Don Carlos Young, is mainly a Queen Anne style, which was popular in America in the 1870s and 1890s. The architect Joseph Don Carlos Young saw this style while living in the East in New York City while attending school. It appears to be a very nice Victorian building, and many people have commented on what appears to be all the wonderful, frivolous, and joyous aspects of the building. But in fact, there's something more to it than just decoration. Many of the Academy building's exterior features have an underlying structural purpose. This idea, called structural rationalism, architect Joseph Don Carlos Young studied through the writings of a French theorist named Emmanuel Fouillée-Ledoux, a very popular 19th century architect and theorist. Fouillée-Ledoux's most admired works were translated into English and sold in America in the 1870s and 90s. Young's library includes a copy of Fouillée-Ledoux's Discourses on Architecture. Fouillée-Ledoux, after decades of studying 11th and 12th century medieval monuments, concluded that the very best architecture had an underlying rational structural purpose underneath this. And he proposed that this was how architecture in the future should be. It should be with purpose and rational. Now, it's hard to think as you look at this building that could possibly be the case. But I ask you, after you leave this lecture, wander that building and see if you can find any decorative elements that do not have a structural purpose behind it. Now, it is speculation on my part. However, it appears that Young did apply this theory to the Academy building. Try to discover the decorative details, as I mentioned, that do not have this. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to show a portion of it where it comes around the dormers. The dormers, which are these decorative windows up above the roof lines, bring light into the upstairs, and it's going to show you the corbel brick, which is the brickwork just underneath the eaves. It is decorative, but it also holds up the rain gutters. And so we're just going to loop you around and show you the dormers. And as you can see, the white woodwork that is just on the top of the eave. Well, this is one of the things that we investigate in the exhibit, and we hope you'll come and look at the exhibit and really take the time to look over the 3D drawings that show and describe this. BYU's first building on Temple Hill is known as the Carl G. Mazer Memorial Building. What you have before you here is the architectural firm of Ware and Treganza's 2D rendering with sculptural orbs representing knowledge and scholarship on the left and faith and religion on the right. And I think if I can point this, use my laser, you see the orbs right here. And there is the Ten Commandments up above with scrolls around it, the beehive up above. Also notice that there is a colonnaded walkway, and you can see vaguely another set of buildings on either side. This is the fruits of BYU's first architectural design competition. It was proposed, staged, and funded by the BYU Alumni Association and Provo Boosters. Notice if you look at this photograph, you see, you'll see on the side looking down at us, Reed Smoot, Jesse Knight, Brother Dusenberry, President Joseph F. Smith, and if you look very carefully on the far side right, you will see George Brimhall, the president of the university. Now, this photo was not an accident. The president, you would think, would be in the front and center, but it's the Alumni Association that really was the driving force behind this building, and it's reflected in the ceremony, in the Cornerstone Lane ceremony. Jesse Knight was the primary contributor to the building of the building. Waring-Tregenza was the only non-LDS firm that was asked to present drawings to this competition. Joseph Don Carlos Young, who we just mentioned, who was the architect of the Academy building, and his son were also in this competition, as well as Emil Mazer, Professor Mazer's son, among others. Now, Waring-Tregenza's campus plan, or Waring-Tregenza's design, won 8 out of 12 of the jurists. And I want to show you how it would have looked if it had been designed the way Waring-Tregenza had envisioned it. You'll note the little orbs. Also, if you look in here, there is a fresco mural that was to depict the glories of Utah. All of these things were scratched because of the cost of the building. The building cost close to $150,000 in 1907 to 1909, a tremendous amount. It was so expensive that it really is the only building that we have of this type, the temple-like with a full load-bearing construction. Now, the Alumni Association wanted to have a collegiate campus separate from the elementary and secondary campus on University Avenue. And so they asked Waring-Tregenza to design a campus with a series of buildings that would be exclusively for the collegiate or for the academic departments. And so what you're seeing on the side, on either side, are 4 buildings that we have kind of analyzed the architecture of the building and then tried to deduce what those buildings may have looked like. Now, the original drawings are missing. As you can see, this design is a U-shaped form. Now, Waring-Tregenza was heavily influenced by a very popular planning style of the time, and that is emulating the University of Virginia's plan. Thomas Jefferson designed the one central temple in the center and then supporting buildings around the side. It was rediscovered, became more appreciated by architects, and Waring-Tregenza basically used that same Virginia plan for their proposed campus. Now, the Provo boosters were very motivated to keep BYU in Provo. The LDS Church had its LDS University in Salt Lake City. The BYU College in Logan was proposing a very large expansion of its campus, and the University of Utah had just designed its Foothill campus in Salt Lake City. And so the Provo boosters were very anxious to make sure that BYU stayed in Provo, and they believed the architecture designed by Waring-Tregenza would express that. And here you see a plan of Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia. I now want to talk about landscape designer LaValle Morris. LaValle was a BYU faculty member from 1924 to 1938. He was a graduate of Utah State Agricultural College in horticulture, Michigan State Agricultural College, also in horticulture, and later Harvard University in landscape design. He was the founder of Utah State University's landscape architectural program. He left BYU, and when he left, the landscape plan or landscape program left with him, and it was established at Utah State in 1939 after he left Provo. Now, what did LaValle accomplish while he was here at BYU? In the illustration you have before you, you see LaValle standing before a drawing that he made of the president's home. He also designed the landscape surrounding Temple Hill, all the way east to 4th East, and all the way over to the north to what is now the Alumni Association, the Alumni Building. Now, others had preceded him in selected plantings. However, Morris made a comprehensive design and plan for the pathways, rustic benches, plantings around the canals, and hundreds of trees. He described this as BYU's Lover's Lane, and it remains today Lover's Lane. Morris also designed the president's home in 1934. For this project, he designed an orchard terraced down the hills, and you can still see a bit of the terracing, a pergola or a colonnaded porch with vines all around it. And if you look down in this photo, you can still see that little pergola and various elements that he also designed around the president's home. It also included a reflecting pond. Here's the pergola. And if you look at the bottom of the photo, you will see the reflecting pond, and then behind the two students, you'll see the pergola. He landscaped the yards, pathways in and around the building. Now, this is a fuzzy photograph, but it just was so beautifully composed that I slipped it in, albeit fuzzy as it is. But this was the official reception center up until the 1940s. And so every student would have access to the president's reception area for various functions, or faculty would, and students would come to see the president. So it was a fairly major part of the landscape at BYU. Well, BYU's first tailor-made dormitories were made by architect Joseph Nelson. Joseph Nelson graduated in a one-year program working for working architects at the University of Pennsylvania in 1907. He was the university's architect from 1919 to the mid-1940s. Here we have the Allen Hall in 1928 and the Amanda Knight Hall in 1929. Designed by Joseph Nelson in the Tudor style, or as fellow BYU employee Paul Anderson has called it, stockbroker Tudor. Close cousin to collegiate Gothic, it has wonderful references to the British higher education of Oxford and Cambridge. You will see high-pitched roofs, half-timbered looking facades, and a picturesque floor plan. Now, these buildings were not the only buildings like this. There were altogether, between the two campuses, the lower campus and the older campus, nearly 40 faculty members that lived in the area, and 10 of them had Tudor-style homes, and the others had period-style homes that fit quite warmly into the neighborhood. Now, this neighborhood was not just for living, it was also for students. Students would go between the two campuses, and so it was, in a sense, the neighborhood was an active part of campus. These two dormitories are embedded in the homes between the two campuses. Here is a 2D drawing of Allen Hall. Next, I'd like to talk about the 1949 plan of BYU. This is the second one. The Warren-Treganza was the first, and the 1946 to 49 was the second time of major planning. Here's the 1946 plan that we have in front of you, and then the next slide shows 1948. We have President McDonald with a member of the faculty looking over this plan. What I want to do is show you some of the things that were designed in this plan. First, I should tell you that Fred Markham was a architect who graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the mid-1920s. He was a trained Beaux-Arts architect, that is, an architect who understood all the different historical precedents that occurred in architecture. He would know all the different all the different orders of architecture. He would know all the famous historic buildings and sites, and from that he would take his inspiration from. And so you also learn to be a very good artist, and this plan by Fred Markham. Now let me show you some of the aspects of this plan, and some of them stay with us even today. First, there is a student center and arts corridor, which actually didn't remain, right here. There is the academic area up above. There is student housing, which was to be on the perimeters. The athletic fields were to be down here on the west side of campus, and that has largely remained with us today. So since the 1940s, we have had these corridors where each of the major parts of campus have been placed. Also, if you will notice, there is a major intersecting, there's a mall coming right down the middle, but right here you will also see an intersecting plan that takes you from the athletic buildings all the way east. That corridor still remains very much the same today. Now, another thing that you could thank Fred Markham for is the gold buff brick. He chose the gold brick in his buildings in the 1940s, and it has remained largely with us to this date. The other thing that's interesting is there is the Botany Pond down here. They were proposing, as I mentioned earlier, to have these wonderful art museum buildings around here, and then there's a student union building. What makes this interesting is all the buildings in this plan, or half of the buildings in this plan, look into Provo. So there's this interest in still being part of Provo. And yes, there's buildings that are being built looking into campus, such as these right here. This is the Irene Science Center right here. But everything else looks towards Provo. That changes in the 1960s. And here you see these fine art buildings. Does anyone know what this photo is of? Can anyone tell me the name of this area of campus? Beg your pardon? Botany Pond. It is the Bertrand Harrison Botanical Garden. Now, it was established in 1941 by President Franklin S. Harris. He wanted to have a botanical garden, which every self-respecting university would have. President Harris assigned botany professor Bertrand F. Harris to design and lay out the gardens, with George Smeath, a landscape architect instructor here at BYU, who would later attend MIT as well in city planning. And this is the plan that they worked out. What Harrison designed and laid out were almost 500 species of plants representing 5 of the major areas of the United States. So there is the southern states, the Pacific Northwest, the Plains and the Great Lakes, and the Rocky Mountain area. And not necessarily in the same order, but as close as they could. We have the South, we have the West, United States, and we have the East. So the garden is largely laid out in the same kind of geographical areas as the regions of the United States. Students dug the pond and the canals from a spring that was on the property. As I mentioned before, there are 500 species. In the 1980s survey, they discovered only about 200 that remain. Although some of the most majestic and beautiful landscape examples or tree examples are here. There's the giant sequoia, the redwood, and also a handful of bald cypress trees. And that, you can see, these right here are the bald cypress trees. And there's 3 or 4 of them that still remain. Initially, when this was laid out, they had planned to put markers on them so that students could see and understand and see an example of all the various specimens that were located in the park. Now, it remains still an active botanical park, although very few people know about this wonderful part of campus. How many here knew about the Botanical Garden? Good. Okay. Finally, I want to talk about the mid-20th century comprehensive plan for BYU. Plans began in 1954 and really finalized by 1957. President Wilkinson invited California University Dean of Architecture and Planning, William Wurst, to consult with Fred Markham and other members here at BYU. This is also the time that Sam Brewster takes charge of physical facilities at BYU. Ernest L. Wilkinson asked Fred Markham to design all the buildings on campus. Markham demurred and asked instead that he be allowed to put together a set of guidelines and that other architects be used in designing the 1950s and 1960 campus. Now, this was also a time of the international style architecture, and one of our perhaps strongest international style. Now, international style is simplified architecture. You know, I was talking about the Joseph Don Carlos Jung and the Academy building and this structural rationalism, this idea that form follows function. Well, we have on campus the early well springs of this idea, and then you have sort of the concluding argument to this idea of form follows function. You have the very simple and stripped down building. BYU has a wonderful modern 20th century campus. And here are all the cliches, all the architectural cliches you will see here on campus in this mid-20th century campus. And they are as follows, and these describe international style architecture. You have flat roofs, you have curtain walls, you have no reference to history. You have brise-soleils, or sun shading fixtures that are placed on buildings. In pictorial terms, it is very flat, solid, rectangular spaces, and it is not always appreciated here at BYU, but surprisingly, it is just a great group of buildings, I believe. Including here is the administration building by Henry Fetzer. And I think it has this incredibly exuberant terrazzo interior space or flooring. When Henry Fetzer laid this out with his son, they had in mind this idea of jets and movement and all the wondrous things that we were thinking of in the night as everyone was thinking in the mid-50s about technology and jets, and so you really get that feeling when you see all this movement in the flooring. And then Fred Markham's Ernest L. Wilkinson student center. Now, all of these buildings were designed with certain they had 5 basic guidelines. One is that it could only be 3 stories high. Now, this building and Deseret Towers is taller. They were, just to add variety, but there were no buildings were to be more than 3 or 4 stories high. They all were to have the gold buff brick. They all were to have as much glass and natural light as possible, and they were all largely to be as rectangular as possible. Now, I want to point this out. This particular design is in an X form, but otherwise everything else is very rectangular. Okay. Just a few photos of campus. These buildings, although simple and beautiful in a modern sense, they have not worn very well, and many of them have to be retrofitted for seismic reasons, and really what you're looking at in this photo is far different than what you'll see today on campus. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. We hope you'll come and enjoy this exhibit, and after Brian gives me the word, we'll have questions and answers. Thank you.